Hi everybody, my name is Norman Swan. Welcome to this session, Why Trust a Scientist? Why indeed trust a scientist? I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Turrbal and Yugara peoples, and First Nations peoples everywhere, and pay respects to their elders past, present elders, and most important of all, emerging elders. And of course, we need to acknowledge that that first peoples around the world were also scientists who experimented and were not just hunter-gatherers. They settled and had really quite amazing developments in Australia and elsewhere, and we pay respects to them. Queensland Museum is proud to be the exclusive host of the World Science Festival in the Asia Pacific. The festival would be impossible to deliver without the assistance of many organizations and individuals. On behalf of the Queensland Museum, I'd like to acknowledge all the partnerships that make the festival possible, and includes the World Science Festival in New York, Queensland Government, Tourism and Events Queensland, Brisbane Economic Development Agency, BHP, Griffith University, the University of Queensland, QUT, and any place that's holding a party for people who are infected with COVID-19. Tonight, we will take your questions by Twitter. You know Twitter? If you don't know Twitter, talk to a 14-year-old. Actually, 14-year-olds don't use Twitter anymore. They use TikTok. What's important, you use the hashtag AskWSFB, hashtag AskWSFB. Now, what we find is people write an essay in their however many characters you're allowed, and then right at the end, they squeeze in a question. Just put only a question there, because we like to flash the question up on the wall, and if you're trolling me, they won't put it up. And it would be nice to include those. Put them up at any time, and we'll try and include them as we go with the discussion. So, welcome to the panel section of the show, and remember, AskWSFB, and tweet your question, and we'll bring them in as we go. Now, we've got several guests for you, some online, some in the studio, some here on the stage, I should say. Our first virtual guest is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Western Australia, and one of Australia's leading mathematicians. She researches group theory and combinatorics, and in 2021 was the first mathematician to receive Australia's highest honour, a Companion of the Order of Australia. Currently, she's helping draft a paper on scientific freedom and responsibility. Please welcome Cheryl Prager.
Hello, Norman. Very pleased to be here.
There's a lot of people out there, Cheryl. Also beaming in is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Adelaide, whose areas of expertise cross three fields: the history and philosophy of science, bioethics and science policy, and food studies. She's someone who's often called upon to translate academic findings into terms more relevant to the broader community. Please welcome Rachel Ankeny. A couple of years ago, Rachel was here on the stage, but in COVID times, Rachel is coming to us from Adelaide. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
The last of our screen dwellers is not an engineer like the rest of her family. She is, however, an award-winning creative director, media personality, and writer with over 14 years' experience at some of Sydney's best advertising agencies. Also a regular commentator when it comes to all things brand-related. Please welcome Karen Ferry. And no doubt we'll bring up some of Carl's issues with Karen. You heard it, didn't you? For our real live, three-dimensional guest on the stage is Niraj Lao, who is a visiting fellow with the ANU Centre for Sustainable Energy Systems and the new host of Imagine This for ABC Kids Listen. He's made regular appearances on TV and radio to talk science, and he's even written a kids' book about an ambitious, astronomically inclined emu. Niraj Lao.
Hi, Norman. Hi, everyone.
So just to expand on some of the things that Carl was talking about, in 1616, the finding that the sun was the center of the solar system, well, it was actually a rediscovery of that finding. It wasn't entirely new. And the Earth wasn't the center of the world. That was banned by the Church and State, the Inquisition and the Pope. Galileo was victimized for it. Even Albert Einstein was ridiculed for his theory of relativity. There were jokes on the stage, on vaudeville stage, about Einstein's theory of relativity. So distrust about science and its findings are not new. But of course, today, it's the sort of things that Carl was talking about, including the major issue of the day, which is climate change. And also, we're seeing lots of disinformation about vaccines. But despite all that, scientists do seem to be going up in regard. Literacy, at least in the COVID pandemic, is going up. I mean, a year ago, I was getting questions about how to wash your hands. And now on Coronacast, we get questions like, well, I read that paper in The Lancet on December 8th on the Astra trial, and I think you got the statistics wrong. And that's not a doctor or a scientist. That's just a member, that's a member of the public. That's the level of literacy that we've got. Cheryl, you've worked in mathematics your whole career. You're working on this white paper on freedom and responsibility in the 21st century. How have challenges changed over the years?
Oh, yes, Norman. Science itself has changed, and the public attitudes also have changed. There's so many things to choose. I thought of three. Like there's new types of science, like artificial intelligence, and there's so much new for the public to catch up with, new methods. So a lack of understanding might make it a bit hard to trust. And on the other hand, it's happening so quickly, as you said, especially with the pandemic, when scientists are actually putting their research results on the web as preprints about the general scientific process of critical review, and so that we can come to a consensus. So it's a bit hard to know what the state is of the new science. And lastly, thinking of the fact that a lot of science is privately funded, and there may be a fear that some of the new results may not be available to public good.
So do you think that people understand the scientific method, how scientists do their work? Coming to Carl's point there with Richard Feynman, which was, it's about not being fooled. That's about wanting to disprove your theory rather than prove it.
Yes, but with the new speed in which everything's being released, I guess scientists themselves haven't followed the usual scientific method. And so it's really hard for the public to know whether a piece of preprint science research is actually accepted, whether the scientific consensus actually got there. So they might have understood it in the past, but maybe it's different now.
So, Niraj, what's your view on this in terms of the public attitude towards science? I mean, you spent a lot of time talking to kids.
Yeah, a little. I think it's a generally positive attitude to science when people come across it. But I just wonder how much people do come across science in day-to-day life. I think it's a little bit different with the work that you do with coronavirus, and Carl, everything you do on radio and TV, and maybe it's different for all of us here. We're at the World Science Festival, so we have some kind of connection with science in a way. But I don't know, generally, if people come across science or scientists in everyday life, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Well, they come across the fruits of science in everyday life.
Yeah, but Niraj, can I jump in? I mean, sorry. I think the thing is that I don't actually think there's a big difference between kind of what we do in our everyday lives that involves measuring, thinking about evidence, thinking about weighing up evidence, and so on. I mean, and so some of my favorite examples, when you decide, to treat your kid's head lice, for example, you're thinking about biology, you're thinking about chemistry, you're thinking about measurement, you're thinking about medicine.
And not vomiting.
I think people, and I think people, not just scientists, do scientific things every day. And one of the really important things we need to do to build trust is to point that out repeatedly.
I totally agree, though. Yeah, I think science is everywhere. I think there's like science in the glasses of water or where we are, the sound that's coming through the universe. But it's the question about the process of science. Do we see it? Do we think, that's like a scientific thing? I wonder about that. But at the same time, I think there is a general kind of growing uncertainty and skepticism and maybe distrust of certainly anything that comes from authority. And
so Cheryl talked about AI, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean, that generates a lot of fear. You know, there's a black box, and I know computer scientists who are frightened of an artificial intelligence, that you've got this computer, in theory, acting autonomously.
It's an interesting question about trust of computers. I think we trust them a whole bunch, and we're doing so more and more. We trust them, in our cars or on our phones. And
but we don't think about them, but as soon as we think about them, we get worried.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And it's a little bit of a scary future with how much AI is going to control, how much algorithms are controlling. I think one of the things we'll talk about tonight is how much algorithms are controlling the information that we get in our media, in our social media.
What's the Dunning-Kruger effect?
The Dunning-Kruger effect is, I think, a little bit what Carl was talking about with the Pierian fountain. Yeah, that's it, right? So certainty on confidence on one bit and then confidence on the other. And if you know a little bit, you're like, oh yeah, I'm like totally
I spend a lot of time at the top of the
so do I.
first curve.
So do I. And then you learn a little bit more. You're like, oh, I don't know anything. There's so much out there. And then over time you get to learn a bit more.
And that's a pattern with the communicator rather than the receiver.
I think so, and I think that maybe contributes to some of the skepticism or the hesitancy around the communication of science. Yeah.
There's been a few world events, Rachel, which have affected the trust in science. I mean, there was Chernobyl. I mean, people might remember thalidomide, which is kind of relevant to today's distrust of vaccines, tobacco. Do you want to take us through those?
Sure. So I think, Chernobyl is a clear one, but there's lots of these incidents. I would also connect it back to, the use of bombs in particularly World War II. And scientists seem to be complicit in building things that have potentially bad effects. And that's actually where a lot of the rhetoric about scientific responsibility, that Cheryl would be really familiar with, goes back to. But I tend to think of these issues as having different facets to them. So I think people get nervous when industry is involved, and there seems to be bias because of industrial involvement. And there, clearly, asbestos was one of those kinds of considerations. Here in Australia, that's probably a very big story, maybe less so elsewhere, but because of the amount of asbestos that was used and the amount of exposure that occurred as a result, we're still living with those effects in many ways today, just because of the extent to which asbestos was used. And we might think about that as business trust, but I think there's a deep issue there about what the science was and why that wasn't exposed. Now, thalidomide's an interesting one because, as you would well know, Norman, there's sort of the positive side of the thalidomide story from an Australian point of view, which was the scientist who pointed out there was a problem. Thalidomide was based here in Australia. But thalidomide was a drug used during pregnancy, particularly for morning sickness, but it was over time found to cause pretty severe malformation of limbs. The interesting follow-up, again, Norman, as you well know, to that is that the scientist who exposed those falsifications, those issues with thalidomide, was himself then accused of fraud down the line with a different drug that he claimed had similar kinds of effects, was used for the same kind of purposes, but did not actually have those effects. So I think that's the third category, is we do see these cases of falsification. We see these cases of science gone rogue, and that does give science a very bad reputation. But finally, I think, the hype doesn't help science. Saying that we found the gene for whatever it is, or saying stem cells are the next answer to everything, but then not actually delivering, again, makes people start to wonder about what scientists are up to and what indeed, they are promising and delivering, plus are we actually benefiting?
Karen, just describe to us the advertising challenge in creating a brand. Because a lot of Carl's talk was about brands protecting their position, perhaps at the expense of science. But what goes into the building of a brand? What's the discipline?
So we look at two things. The first thing is the product that you start with. So if in terms of science, that could be whatever you're selling. And then we talk about the way that we want that story to play out. So often when you're talking about something scientific, so we'll take asbestos, for example, it was presented as something that was really family friendly, something that was appearing every day because it was appearing in people's houses. That is the story. But the product itself, asbestos, would then have fact points around it. So it would be about, I think in the case of asbestos, it was about price and usability and how easy it was to roll out. If you then are protecting that brand, you then try and protect the product points, and you then try and also protect your brand story. So you always want to make sure that in the case of asbestos, we want to they as a brand, we're always trying to keep things really safe, really familiar. And we saw that obviously, I think most Australians know the story of how that kind of plays out over the next few decades.
So if science was a brand, what would be your analysis of it as an advertising consultant?
The product is good. It has a very long story that I think if you're an average consumer, people struggle to engage with because it seems really passive. That's quite a blunt analysis of it, but it is dry, and that's for a reason. But people like things that are fun and emotionally engaging. I know we were talking before, Rachel, about how people are making decisions with headlights and stuff like that. Most people believe they make rational decisions when they make decisions in their lives, but I think it's something like 90% or 98% is emotional. And so science is a very rational thing, but people emotionally struggle to relate with it. And I think that's where we start to see downfall in certain communications around things.
So I'm inclined to stop the panel discussion now. I mean, can you create a science brand that's true to the evidence, that can communicate clearly and use emotion?
Yeah, definitely.
This is like a brew and transfer competition now.
You think about, like, you go to Questacon or the Powerhouse Museum or anything, even I think any museum that's designed for kids, and those are emotional stories that you engage with. And the way that we make them emotional is to talk about, you have this in your life, and here is why it's great, and isn't this fantastic? Or learn the story of a whale, and you relate to the whale. And it's like, those are all emotional things. So we can do that really well. It's just, we have to make sure when we're communicating about the science is to always respect the facts and to keep things very neutral as well, because if they start to lend too much into emotion, too much into opinion, that's when it gets really dangerous and it loses its credibility.
So we'll circle back to some of the specific challenges in a moment, and let's look at some successful and not so successful campaigns engaging the public in science, you might call it science or not, where it was important to get the public to understand, trust, in some cases to act, and sometimes it's hit and miss. Let's look at this smoking ad from the 1930s. So essentially, doctors around the world promoted smoking as really wonderful for you.
And I think, Norman, that's one case where the science went both ways in some way. To a certain extent, big tobacco and what a colleague of mine have called the merchants of doubt that were behind the tobacco industry really got doctors on side and scientists to say, look, there isn't harm here. It's actually a good thing. And because of that, then over time, the public ended up conflicted. They weren't sure what to think because they were hearing different messages, all from authorities that they thought they were supposed to trust, doctors and even scientists. And so I think, that probably in some sense was a really clever campaign, because it used that authority of science and medicine to say, this is in fact good for you. Layer on top of that it was addictive, and you kind of have a foolproof approach.
I think what was really interesting about that one and the tobacco campaign, they enlisted the help of 3 really distinguished, eminent scientists, like the president of the National Academy of Sciences in America, some really well-known people, and they were funded by industry to introduce doubt into that conversation, to say, well, consensus hasn't been reached and no one's proven that tobacco causes cancer. And that playbook was played out with tobacco and acid rain and pesticides and CFCs and the hole in the ozone layer, and then with climate change. And we're seeing the effect today. And I think that was one of the starts of how science, the view of it, was tarnished a bit.
So you're writing this paper, Cheryl, on freedom and responsibility in science, that's what happens when you give scientists freedom. Freedom to take money from Exxon.
Well, we have responsibility and ways of proceeding, and I think all scientists must respect these ethics and ways of coming to conclusions and communicating the conclusions and being willing to communicate with decision makers. And this is the sort of thing we're seeing right now with the pandemic, that the scientists really are stepping up and they're explaining properly to the decision makers who can then communicate. As I listen to you every morning on the breakfast show.
Well, if you hear that, then you'll hear my criticism that, in fact, they're getting bad advice at a federal level, which is why this poor registrar, Princess Alexandra, got infected, because she was following the advice of the federal government scientists that you don't need to wear an N95 mask, and we've now got 25 people at a party getting infected with COVID from this poor woman who wasn't wearing an N95 mask thanks to the scientific advice of the Commonwealth. I mean, this is a minefield, isn't it, Cheryl?
Yes. I mean, scientists do their best. They produce advice. They model. They look at what's happening. They do their best. They test it out against the data, but then they must be ready to look at where the model doesn't fit the data and come back and do more science. And that's a bit of a difficult process to understand. And it depends really on the trust scientists to take into account all of the data and the methods, and to be able to communicate what they know and what are perhaps the error bounds, which is maybe a difficult thing.
I think you can't ever get rid of the values. Science, is made up of well-established knowledge, but it always involves values in terms of the problems that people even choose to investigate, how they choose to investigate it. But then when you translate any of those findings that are already, influenced by values into policy or into a political domain, it's inevitably going to be a case that you get a combination of different factors coming together. And I think that's the part about science that people often don't understand. They talk about the facts of the matter, but that's facts that have been established under certain kinds of conditions, with certain kinds of assumptions, and with certain kinds of goals. And so I think it's critical to say, well, maybe it is a bad thing to have industrial involvement in science, but particularly where it's not transparent. I'm much less bothered by scientists who, for example, partner with industry for good outcomes, so long as that's transparent and people are very clear about how that's influencing the way in which they're doing science. It's where it's hidden, as it was for a very long time in the case of the tobacco companies, that I think it's got a lot more potential for things to go wrong.
I think there's some danger there. It's a news story that broke just this week, I think, or last week. They found out that one of the pipelines that they're hoping to build, gas pipeline from Queensland to New South Wales, one of the environmental impact assessment reports for that, supposedly independent and scientific, was done and completed by a company that was a shareholder in the owner of the project, and that's like. That's a conflict of interest. Yeah, it is, and it wasn't, and it wasn't communicated. It wasn't transparent, and I think there is a danger there. So for me,
I'm losing trust in scientists as a result of this conversation so far. and Karen, aren't you getting? I mean, in the advertising public relations industry, you exploit that. I mean, in fact, the same.
Not you personally, but no.
I mean, the same company that got Kevin Rudd elected killed the carbon tax.
Yes. So most, I guess...
Well, I shouldn't call it carbon tax. That's Tony Abbott's phrase. A price on carbon.
Yeah. Advertising agencies and PR agencies are non-partisan in that they will convey whatever message the client wants. So it can be something that is as large as choosing which clients you do and do not advertise for and the messages that the client wants you say, to something as small as employing scientists to convey a message that the brand wants, and sometimes that's not a real message. So you look at even the basic things like beauty advertising, they talk about the 7 signs of aging, they talk about hair fall, they talk about things that they pretend is scientific fact, and 9 out of 10 scientists agree that this cream will make your skin younger. That's not true, but they've paid scientists to say that so they can say it, and that is just because it makes a good advertising message.
So where does regulation come in here, Karen? Because we control tobacco not through education. We controlled it by banning advertising, putting high taxes on tobacco, and stopping sponsorship.
Yep, and I think also the government initiative of putting the photos of cancerous effects of smoking on the packets also played a big part in that as well, so and removing the branding.
At some point, you've got to insist on promoting the right science, and it's up to government. Because the advertising industry is not going to do that.
No, and advertising regulation is that if a scientist agrees to say something, then it is fine. And it doesn't matter whether those scientists have been paid, because obviously they've done a job.
I think there's a really interesting point in who pays for what. I think one of the principles that we can establish trust by is by asking the question, cui bono, like who benefits? And so scientists who are paid by universities and public research dollars, their like metric is putting papers out there, making impact, getting the word out there with their science. And that's the aim of that money going to scientists, is to produce that outcome. I think that has some, pitfalls in scientists overselling their research. But it's different if the government is paying for the science, or if an industry is paying for the science, or a defence organisation is paying for that science. And I think there should be some scepticism around that.
But we have really good ways of doing that in this country, I think. I mean, we have good programs that bring together industry partners plus scientists sitting at universities and otherwise to do work that ticks both boxes. That's good science, but actually produces something that an industry is seeking, or whatever else.
Well,
and
that's
the nice
very
thing about
Pollyanna-ish of you. The best predictor of a positive clinical trial is who funded it.
I know. So in medicine, I was about to say, Norman, I think in medicine there needs to be a lot more oversight of that. But I think we do, at our peril, what we don't want to happen is have industry be doing its science behind closed doors and lose the potential for that transparency and that partnership.
So
and so I think we're better off to harness that and make it transparent than kind of have public and private science be completely separate.
Let's take a Twitter question. I think there is one there, if it's going to come up on the screen. So how do we get scientists to follow the ethics and follow consensus? Cheryl.
Oh, one way is through the research funding agencies. There's a code of ethics, there's consequences if they're not following the code. They'll just lose their funding. I don't know how to do it with private funding.
What you're saying is that should happen, but it doesn't happen. I mean, I was the one who exposed Bill McBride for his fraud. And they put in
be evil. But
sorry, what did you say?
And I think currently we have limited mechanisms. I mean, we've seen this with a number of plagiarism and falsification cases more recently. And there's mechanisms. Journals supposedly are supposed to be checking these things. Institutional ethics committees are checking these things. But I think there is a need for a real look at the culture, particularly, as Niraj was suggesting, of over-promising, or of the kind of metrics by which people are trying to sell their science, which often seems to push people too hard, too fast, potentially, to declare results before they're valid, to falsify and plagiarize. And we have had an increasing amount of that in this country.
I'd agree with that, Rachel. And I think that there's two parts to that question. Following the ethics, I don't know if there's a way to make people be ethical. It's a tricky kind of question, a cultural question. The second part is following consensus. I don't know if we want scientists to follow consensus always. I think that's one of the ways science moves forward is through breaking consensus and doing that with good data.
So evidence is better than consensus in terms of that word.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this issue of emotion and how you use emotion and whether it's true to the science. In other words, when science plays the game of the advertising industry, And when AIDS hit in the 80s, this ad went to air. Let's watch it.
The fact is, over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead. That if not stopped, it could kill more Australians than World War II. But AIDS can be stopped, and you can help stop it. If you have sex, have just one safe partner, or always use condoms. Always.
That was the relaxing little 30 seconds of our life. And it was hugely controversial at the time.
Did it work?
Well, I think it did work. Karen, what's your analysis of that ad?
So, it worked in terms of awareness. It made people really understand how serious this illness was. And it worked in that people remembered it. So people thought it ran for like 6 months when it only ran for, I think, 3 to 6 weeks. We remember it now, decades on. But what they learned, what the advertising industry in Australia learned, and the government as well, was that it had an unintended side effect in that because it is metaphoric, we have our Grim Reapers who are bowling at people, that they're meant to represent AIDS. But what actually happened was people aligned it with their own prejudices about the LGBTIQ plus community and thought the Grim Reaper symbolized gay men. And so what it did was perpetuate, and amplify these prejudices that ended up vilifying and ostracizing the gay community, especially in a time when they were incredibly vulnerable. So it was really effective, and that scare campaigns are really effective, and it was very visceral imagery, but it was also very negative, and it is something that we will never see the government do again because it had such a bad side effect on a lot of the community.
So let's watch one of the campaign ads for COVID-19.
My mum's in ICU with COVID. We visited her a few weeks ago, but I didn't know that I had COVID. I had no symptoms. A week earlier, my mate cooked dinner. Tom said he'd just had a cold. He works with Sophie, who said she just had a sniffle. We all had COVID and didn't know it. We can't change that, but we can all change what we do in the future. Be COVID safe and save lives. Visit health.gov.au, authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
So your analysis of that one, Karen?
I personally have issues with that ad because it perpetuates the stereotype that millennials at the time when this ad was playing were the people who are most likely to be spreading COVID, when actually, out of all the demographics, millennials were the ones who were most concerned about it. It also showed people living in sharehouse situations and having to work in very unregulated work, like working in a cafe, as the people who are spreading it, and they're the people who can't actually control the situation. So I don't really like that, but I do think that the visual imagery of it was quite good. I think the other ads they did, the government, that were more illustrative based and much more fact based about things that you can do, were much better because they removed the hysteria out of it, which was the biggest thing that Australia needed at the time when we saw people panic buying and freaking out and not knowing what to do.
So my question to you, Rachel, is why does it take a catastrophe for us to change and turn to science?
So, I think we like to turn to science because in our probably heart of hearts, we do like authority and we want to be told what to do. But we also want a silver bullet, right? And often we think science is going to provide that kind of silver bullet, and therefore we will retreat back to science, particularly where there's a major threat, like COVID at the moment, right? But it's the daily science where I think we tend to push back, the things that are more distant or less immediate, things that we can't see around us. Ironically, climate change for a long time was one of those, and arguably we've started to turn a corner because we're seeing it more through bushfires, through drought, and whatever else. But we have this sort of habit of looking to science, as you say, only in times of crisis. But I think that's because then we're seeking an immediate answer, and that sets up a situation where science is almost always bound to fail, because immediate answers aren't really what science typically can provide.
I wonder if we do always turn to science in a crisis. Sometimes people turn to religion or conspiracy theories or some other kind of solidity or something where they can grasp onto. And I think we're seeing that a lot with coronavirus. There's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories.
Because there was no science there to rely on at the beginning.
Well, that's right.
We were back in the 15th century.
That's right. And so in uncertain times, it's not just science that we cling to. I think it's one of the things, but it's not the only thing.
I think that our government, the decision makers are definitely listening to scientists a whole lot more than they did, I would say, climate change until now.
Are they listening to scientists about climate change, do you think, Cheryl?
I think they're starting to, but they're definitely listening to scientists over the COVID pandemic. They have scientific advisors, and scientists are also stepping up and trying to communicate more accurately and in a plain way. There's just politicians, media, and also through their own scientific media campaign, like the Australian Academy of Science has these little videos issued every few weeks, which are really trying to communicate important scientific facts and findings.
I just wonder what you think about whether success creates doubt in its own right. So CFCs, the destruction of the ozone layer. Well, there was no destruction of the ozone layer because we got rid of CFCs. Yeah. But some people still say, well, why did you do that? Nothing happened. There were warnings sounded about population growth in the 1960s. The world hasn't come to an end. There hasn't been the global food crisis, at least yet, that we've predicted. The Grim Reaper ad said, more people are going to die World War II. Of course, they didn't. And of course, we were predicting, if you look at my trawling account, I call my tweets, people say, oh, well, you were predicting that we were going to be like Italy in 2 weeks, and we weren't. Well, when prevention happens, nothing happens, and therefore, the people who don't want to believe don't actually celebrate the success of science.
That's an interesting question. I think there's a natural tension there in providing that call at the start to say this could be really bad if we don't do anything about it, and we paint that picture of how bad it's going to be, and then slowly we listen to that advice, and then it kind of it's not as bad as it was, and then we're like, oh, you're just kind of shouting from the rooftops. And next time, if you say something's really bad, do we need to think about it? Yeah, Rachel?
So I think what you said earlier, though, Niraj, is absolutely right. In these sorts of settings of crisis, we see not everyone turning to science. That wasn't what I was claiming, but I do think science has a role for some people, but also these crises bring out a lot of fringe, a lot of people seeking to make money, also out of false claims and so on. And so what I think we see, particularly when the evidence is negative, which is a hard concept for people to get their hands around, we prevent something, we equally see lots of people going in different directions because the space gets filled up in times of crisis of people trying to, abuse people's trust.
I would also argue that when people are turning to conspiracy theories, they actually also believe they're listening to scientists. Like climate change, for example, I think it's almost 100% of scientists agree that it is a thing, but a poll of Australians showed that Australians thought that only 66% of scientists agreed. So there is this huge skew where they're hearing these incorrect informations or very niche, fringe, outer theories, and they think that that is also science, because it could still be science, it could still just be science on different points, but I think most people don't have the ability to interrogate what is the right science versus what is maybe pretending to be science.
Totally. I think that's a really great point, and I think it's maybe a result of the media environment that we find ourselves in, the social media environment that we find ourselves in, and the kind of echo chambers that we get funneled into, the filter verses of one. If anyone hasn't seen The Social Dilemma, it's on Netflix. It's really great. I'd recommend you watch it. It shows it exposes the business model of those organisations that put media in front of our eyes, which is, the model is to keep us scrolling past content so we see more ads in front of our eyeballs. And they're really successful at it. And that content that pushes us, that makes us keep scrolling is stuff that we agree with, or extreme content that we have a reaction to.
But Cheryl, a lot of this is exploiting doubt. That if you want to actually get your voice heard and you're opposing the science, you say there's doubt. You get the anti-climate change scientist who creates that situation that Karen was just talking about, which is you think that because you hear it again and again and again, you think it's more common than it is. Anti-vaxxers, who are only 2 or 3% of the population, get a lot of airtime, and you think the anti-vaccination movement is much bigger than it is. More people are just hesitant and they're willing to have the vaccine. Do you think that, but really what scientists fall into the trap, which has really been true to the science, which is a bit uncertain. You can never be absolutely certain about a scientific discovery.
No, you absolutely can't be certain, but it makes me feel very angry when I hear these unscientific claims. I mean, I'm angry about the science, about the scientists, but it's sort of understandable when people are hearing all sorts of different things. I've been in a situation where the whole paradigm shift in my mathematical research was totally changing. And even in the scientific mathematical community, it was clear that some people were very angry that change would be taking place. And they really didn't think the methods that I was using, I should be using. And so even in the scientific community, there's a problem with new methods and acceptability of new results and new paradigms. And I think that's what we're seeing here with the vaccine. And I just hope that there's better trust in the vaccine as we see that it works.
Let's take another question off Twitter. Do you believe that anti-intellectualism has risen in recent times? Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's fairly good evidence that, at least here in Australia, let's stick to that for a moment, there is a rise towards anti-intellectualism. I personally don't think people in universities and even intellectuals at large are helping the situation. So I think we often bemoan the fact that there's anti-intellectualism and it just notches up. I do think people working at universities and so on, people who still have jobs, we must note, of course, there's been a lot of change in universities. We're very lucky to be able to do what we do, to be able to be paid, to do research, to teach excellent students, and so on and so on. And I think, there's not enough awareness that part of this is about fear, part of this is about the instability of the economy at the moment. And it's about the fact that it's not really clear to a lot of people what intellectuals, if you will, or academics or scientists in particular, what is it that they do exactly? And that's where I think it is really our job to do a better job to explain that and to show where public benefit comes into the picture.
I totally agree with that. I think it's becoming more and more of a challenge to preach to the unconverted, to speak to people who aren't already agreeing with you or aren't already interested in what you do. It's maybe the media too, but to have conversations with people on the other side, it becomes harder and harder to do. And I think it's imperative on people in academia or people with knowledge to speak and speak openly and communicate that and communicate the uncertainty too.
So the question for you, Karen, is you've got brands. You've got Carl as a brand in Australia. You've got Brian Cox, who's a brand who is more of a first-line scientist, whereas Carl and I and others are more commentators, several steps removed from the lab bench. Let's just look at the Twitter accounts of Brian. I mean, Brian's got, is overwhelmed by Boris Johnson's Twitter account. Perhaps not surprisingly, but Brian does have 3 million. So I mean, do scientists need to get on like Carl is onto TikTok? And do little dances?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, I think we see Carl or Brian Cox perform really well, and the same with you, Norman, is because there is this weird thing that's happened in the past few years, and we saw it happening when Donald Trump started coming to power, was that people responded to him, and we've seen it happen with other politicians, because they spoke in language that was very easy to understand. And when we see Brian Cox speaking, or you and Carl, it's that ability to interpret really difficult information in a way that anyone who does not have anything higher than a high school diploma can clearly get. And it's really just about the message being much more digestible, but also in that way, TikTok scientists perform really well because you're talking to an audience who isn't receiving that information from anywhere else. You look at example in America, it does really well because most of those children don't get that information from high schools. So for them, it's something really factually interesting and new. And also it has a coolness factor to it. And I think it's the same with Twitter, or the same with Instagram. And it's also why wellness influencers and talk about, I guess, like alternate therapies, they do really well on social media because they perform really well in the media itself. And that's just, again, talking about how you communicate your message in a way that people understand.
Right. So the Pete Evans phenomenon.
Yeah. Like, there's so many people of his ilk who are very good at doing Instagram stories or Instagram posts, and they have millions of followers because of it. And also, it adds up to that repeating information that and then that agreeing ability to it. But it comes down to the fact that he's a chef, but people think he's a scientist because he seems like he's communicating science that they get.
Well, cooking is chemistry, as they say.
It is. Yeah, that's true.
Let's talk about climate change. It is the dominant risk to us. I mean, we'll get through COVID eventually. And climate change just sits there, and it's been going on through COVID. The tundra is beginning to melt, which is the real tipping point. The land-based ice masses are falling into the sea, which is going to be the tipping point for climate, for very rapid and much more rapid than we predicted. I mean, I remember, I must just tell you an anecdote. I was chairing a meeting from Melbourne City Council many years ago, and it was on the impact of climate change and how transport should respond. And I think his name's Graham Turner, CSIRO, who's a modeler. And Graham had recalculated the Club of Rome predictions. So the Club of Rome had made predictions, I think in the early 70s, about which way it was going to go with population and multiple changes in the environment. And it was a pretty disastrous scenario. And he had recalculated to discover that and his calculation was that with the latest data, we were on the middle level, the mid-ground of the Club of Rome predictions. And that had, if I remember rightly, global collapse at round about 20 in about 60 or 70 years from now. And that means the global population drops from 9 billion to 200 or 300 million. So I'm sitting there, and this room was full of men with beards and cardigans. And they're all just going, conservatives, they're all scientists, and they're just going nods. And they could see that I was going pale. And they said, well, why are you going pale? You're the science journalist. We know this. How come you don't know this? Where literally you get a massive population crash, where every system, carbon, phosphorus, water, falls apart. And we're heading in that way. And we might be heading faster than we think. So Karen, it just takes 1 or 2 seats in central Queensland, which have people who are employed by the coal industry, to change the politics of the nation.
Yeah.
How do we combat that? Through science.
Through science.
And,
okay, so,
and your skills in advertising.
Yes. Yeah, I was like,
maybe more your skills.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, science is trying to
harnessing science to your skills.
Yeah. It's interesting because there has been a lot of discussions about how climate change communications keep falling down. There is a general apathy to it, and what its biggest issue is, beyond the political problems of we don't have a government that is agreeing that it is an existing issue, is a combination of neurologists and psychologists have analysed people's brains and how they respond to messaging, and what they found is that the human brain cannot comprehend it for two reasons. The first is that it is very big and slow moving, and because it is so far in the distance, we don't have the fear mechanism to react. So it doesn't feel like it's impending for our own lives. The second one is it's such an abstract concept that you think about pollution. We can respond to that really well. It's why zero waste does so well, is because we can see the outcome of it. Because carbon, or because it's all about emissions and they're all invisible, and the way that we generate emissions is something that we can't see ourselves, it's really hard for people to misunderstand. So there are a few things that we can do to make it work really well. The first one is making it clear what's in it for me and why I should care. And the second one is making it seem really achievable for people to have. So often you see the gamification of metrics and being like, if you do this, you can, reduce this many emissions. Ecosia is an example of how they make it metric based, but also addressing why people are so resistant in the first place. And what you see is every time it's raised, people have an immediate, I don't know how to describe it, like a defense mechanism of being like, but you still use a phone, but you still drive a car, but you do this, this, and this, and this. And there is this inherent thing that people don't want to change the behaviour, but they also don't want to accept blame for having done something that might have made the earth worse. So that's a big issue. But I think in this case, a scare tactic would work really well, because there is a theory in all communications about climate change is that we can't talk about the full negative effect of what that is, which is that we will live in a country that is mostly flooded, unlivable to live in, huge population wipeouts and climate refugees. That we don't speak about that because it makes people too scared, and that they will have an incredible fast shutdown. But I think no one actually knows the effects of that, and that will be happening to our children. Like people who are having babies, are they sitting there and thinking, I want my children to be the best person, so he is going to have to learn how to fight in a war that will happen because of climate change? No. Like, that's not a conversation that we're happening. Those are conversations that really should be happening, and that's where I think we can add in that emotional story.
I wonder if you reckon there's also, Karen, an opportunity to simplify the message a bit. I feel like there's lots of messages going on, but I mean, Carl explained it beautifully.
Well, you can simplify it and just say we're stuffed.
Well, no. I mean, that's one. It's not that bad. But
well, it probably is actually.
No, but the physics of climate change is, the science of it's really simple. You get fossil carbon out of the ground and you put it in the atmosphere, you burn it, you make CO2, and that's a blanket. And that's the biggest thing that we can talk about, not soil carbon or tree carbon or livestock or farming. I think it's that simple question of we just keep digging stuff out of the ground and burning it, and I think that's the message. Australia is the largest exporter of coal in the world, the largest gas exporter in the world, and maybe that's the conversation that we can have, to stop digging it out of the ground. What do you reckon, Karen? Is there an opportunity to simplify it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also what's worked really well is using language that isn't politically weighted. So there's certain words that people hear and they're like, oh, lefties. Yeah. And just switching the language around so that way it's much more fact-based. Like, it's amazing how if you talk about floods or bushfires or farmers, Australians will immediately be like, this is an important cause. Where if you start to add any what we would call scientific words, so any of the language that we've currently been using, like climate crisis, people will be triggered by that and think that it's a political issue that isn't aligned to their party. And it's just that funny thing of switching those up immediately opens up your audience to be a message that they're much more receptive to. So keeping it really simple, changing the language so that it's not like heavily weighted or skewed, is just like the first basic steps of getting people to hear a message they didn't think they were listening to.
Cheryl, do you think scientists are up for this communication task? I mean, you're talking about freedom and responsibility, but do you think that they're willing to take on the responsibility for that communication task?
I definitely hope so. I mean, we're training ourselves at the moment, and we're doing this sort of science, like we have models that are as simple as possible to be useful, and then we can test. And with the pandemic, we've been able to show sort of graphs that show you what range of different outcomes you could have for different policies. Surely we can do the same for climate change. But I hope the answer really is a resounding yes, that we're prepared to do it.
Let's take another Twitter question. No, we will. Oh, yes, here we go. How do we help people move away from trusting a black and white lie towards trusting in the grey truth? That's a good question. Rachel?
So I think one of the important things here is how science puts itself forward as far as what it is actually providing. And I think it needs to be better at talking about the sorts of things Cheryl was talking about, that the best available science does change over time. And that way people will not be disappointed when, you know, the advice that was 5 years ago is different than the advice of today. That isn't a problem. That's actually an asset. That is a sign that science is working right. And so, unfortunately, living in the gray zone is more difficult. Black and white answers are really nice things. But I think science needs to put forward a clearer idea that it is precisely about this kind of gray zone. It's the best available evidence that we have at the moment. It's not promising that it is the way it's going to be in the future, but that we need to act on the best available evidence.
But that's where the politics comes in, is it not?
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's a really lovely question there, and I think...
But it's exactly what politicians exploit. They say, well, it's a grey
I
zone.
know.
You're going to change the whole world because of these guys can't...
I totally agree. But I reckon, actually, I think skepticism is a good thing, actually. I reckon our society maybe needs more of it rather than less. But alongside that skepticism, there needs to be a conversation about, well, what makes something that we can all believe? How do we agree upon a set of facts about a universe that we agree upon? And that's the process of science. That's evidence-based reasoning and critical thinking and Occam's razor, choosing the simplest solution, and peer-reviewed science. And I think we can have that conversation more. And I think I think that's part of our education. Maybe is less content because there's so much out there and searchable, and more about how to figure out what to believe.
And can that be translated into 180 characters and a 15-second TikTok, Karen?
Oh, God. No.
You can give it a go, Norman. Dance.
I'm not as good as Carl.
It's a funny one because you're asking people to be uncomfortable, and uncomfortable in the way that they're not going to know what to believe in. And sitting in that uncomfortable spot I personally find it's really fascinating, but lots of people don't like it and they don't want to do it. And it's that weird spot. If we, think about the Dunning-Kruger chart, it's like sitting there in the middle of enlightenment, of being like, you will never know, and you have to be okay with that.
So I'll tell you an interesting phenomenon I think that I've noticed during COVID, which is kind of taking me aback at times, which is that when people are fearful, they want to cling to someone they can trust. And we had a problem, we've got a problem right now as journalists covering COVID with the vaccines, but we also had a problem when the second wave hit in Victoria. So just a little bit of background. The main reason the second wave hit in Victoria was that they have got a badly organized healthcare system, and with 88 different health services which don't look after the population, unlike most other states, and they long ago degraded the public health service. And in 2009, their public health capacity. 2009, they ran the white flag up during the flu pandemic and stopped testing because they didn't have the capacity. Dan Andrews was the health minister. So it's no surprise that when in June came along, July, that the second wave hit Victoria, not other states, because they did not have the capacity. When you reported that to Victorians, they did not want to hear it. They were angry, and they fed it back, and they were clinging to Dan because they had to cling to somebody. And the question is really whether how you, and premiers exploited that. The premiers were largely good, but they didn't tell the truth. None of them did. They told barefaced lies to the camera, but they held trust. And this thing about trust, because there's no scientists that they trust really, it's leaders that they trust. I suppose the chief health officers became figures of trust in that environment.
Interesting question. Would we have had that same trust if they communicated that uncertainty, if our leaders did, or if the chief health officers did?
Well, I mean, and the other thing I think about it, Norman, is that that's the looking backward part, sort of, and people are tired of the blame game. They just want to know what happens next. And, having decisive leadership, even if we disagree in many of the cases about the decisions that are made, the decisiveness carried the day.
But I remember seeing at least a health advisor displaying a chart with different possible growths of the pandemic, depending on what policies were implemented. And that's trying to convey a sense of non-deterministic outcomes, because you can't be absolutely sure.
I think that's right, Cheryl. Do you think that will leak, Karen, to other issues? That we'll see the ongoing benefit of that, from what you know of how public opinion works?
What do you mean by
So in other words, we're kind of maybe living with uncertainty. We have seen those graphs. We kind of understand it. We go with them. We quite like it when they fess up to, we made a mistake. We've got a problem in hotel quarantine, but we're dealing with it. In other words, the appearance that we're being straight and dealing with uncertainty. Do you think that will leak to other issues, that acceptance?
I think it will for them as individuals that we have seen on TV every day or week and stuff like that. It will help them politically. But in terms of making people easier in accepting this from other voices or other points of information, no. We say, for example, Melbourne's relationship with Dan Andrews, that is this weird thing, and people would tune in every day, and it became the same way that we relate to a celebrity or a newsreader, because you're seeing that person, you're hearing that information, so you feel like you're forming a relationship, which is a very weird thing that people have with celebrities, is that they feel like there's someone in their village, even though the celebrity never sees them. So it works for them as a person, but that relationship doesn't transfer to anything else. So there is a continuing anxiety that people have developed through COVID, and even though that is something that people have now lived with for 12 months, we will do anything to get rid of that. So we won't want to continue that carried through with climate change, for example. People will still want an answer, even though an answer cannot be given. And
the other dilemma is vaccines.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I reckon one of the interesting things we saw was with the pause, the AstraZeneca pause, last month, I think, and
well, it feels like last month. It was last week.
Was it?
Yeah.
I don't know when it was. It feels like a long time ago. Anyway,
yeah, I know.
Yeah, but you know better than anyone really, but they found blood clots amongst the population in Europe, slightly higher than what they would average expect. In some countries said, we're going to pause for a bit. And Australia was like, oh no, everything's fine, no worries, this is good to go, like everyone just trust us. And I think that was exactly the wrong message that they put out. I think it's got better over time. They started to put some numbers around it. I think it's like 18 people got blood clots out of 1 million people, and they expected statistically average would have been 2. So something to look at, something to be concerned about, but not incredibly statistically significant, and needed to be weighed up against the risks of getting COVID and dying from it. But, yeah.
I think that's very good to explain the data like that.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
But what I would welcome from scientists is somebody standing up and saying, well, here's the graph.
Yeah.
Here's the odds. And it's not clearly, and I don't see scientists doing that terribly well.
But do you think, Norman, this is something I've been wondering about, that it's actually a good thing that people aren't overextending their expertise in the COVID moment? In lots of other moments, we get scientists weighing in far outside their core areas of expertise. But I'm feeling as though there's a staying a bit closer to home and trying to entrust to people who actually have epidemiological expertise and so on. And that's a perennial issue. There are some people who are very good science communicators, but you do need to be careful about this sort of straying. So how do we balance that in the kind of way in which we enlist the public? That's a question that I always wonder about.
Let's take another Twitter question. How do we combat conspiracy theories?
I think it's with education.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think and for young folk, maybe more than anyone else, to talk about how do we believe something? What makes something believable? How do
Well,
we trust
you do a lot of communication with kids. Do you think there's a bit of reverse education going on from kids to adults?
Yeah, I think they can. I mean, they teach us a whole bunch. They believe a whole bunch of stuff, and certainly what adults tell them. They also, the universe is so incredible. They're learning about it all the time that they see a complex fact and they're like, oh, all right, I'm just going to register it away. There's lessons that we can learn there, but I think that's the long-term solution, is to help the education of how we learn stuff. So there's so much content out there. The problem isn't finding content or finding information. It's to figure out what to believe.
But I think we're never going to educate people completely. I mean, then they'd be scientists themselves, right? So my line in this domain always is that you have to think about it in terms of engagement, and in particular, getting people's heads around the idea of the kind of processes that are involved in science, and being transparent about the fact that scientists make mistakes. Things get corrected over time.
But the question was
people
about...
do benefit. And all of this has to do with kind of debunking that science is extremely special, so that those conspiracy theorists, don't seem as though they're sounding the emperor has no clothes, that they're exposing those things about what's wrong on the other side.
Karen?
I think we have to...
Sorry,
oh,
Cheryl.
Sorry.
No, go, Cheryl.
I think we have to call out the errors and have a clear presentation of the evidence. And scientists aren't great with that. We really have to do it better.
And one of the things that's happening is regulation, Karen, of social media.
Yeah, regulation is great because it means that the way that algorithms work in YouTube and TikTok is that they reserve you messages you've heard. And so often a lot of people will get indoctrinated into QAnon because they fall into a YouTube hole. And so having the ability to ban certain messaging is really important if it's really incorrect and actually quite harmful. But on top of that, one of the things that has shown to work with people who are trapped in conspiracy theories, where they, I guess, broke out of the thinking, was that they would encounter something in the theory that didn't match something that they knew in their real life that didn't correlate. So, for example, a developer, like he was an IT guy who knew how to code, was really into QAnon, and it was only when he was reading the coding that apparently went with some false information about the US government that he realized that it was false because the code was incorrect. And that was the glitch that kind of helped him break out. So I think, yes, we can present information that is science-based, but I think it's important to present information that people already know is true that doesn't match what the theory is, because then that shows them that it isn't reinforcing what they believe, but rather conflicts against that, and then it allows them to have critical thinking, because I think that's the problem, is that we aren't taught how to think critically and how to analyse things properly, and that's why it starts to get all out of control.
Well, I'm going to take the chair's privilege and have the last word here. And I think there is something that we've learned from the pandemic that is a lesson for science, which is this pandemic was controlled by all of you. It wasn't controlled by us. It wasn't controlled by government. It was actually controlled by people of Queensland and people of Australia. And they were ahead of government. So business was already locking down and keeping people from home. We were all socially distancing, and we forced the government into action, you, I should say, as a community. So communities control pandemics, and communities will control climate change. And it's your responsibility as much as the responsibility of scientists. Can you please thank our wonderful panelists? Fantastic that you're all wearing masks. If we wore masks, it would just be a bit like that. And, but let's hope that Queensland goes very quietly over the next few days. Please go safely yourselves and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you very much.